The blood in the snow wasn't from a wounded deer. Thaddeus Morrow knew that the moment he saw the dark red stains leading toward his property line, disappearing and reappearing like breadcrumbs through the Wyoming wilderness. 28 years of ranching had taught him to read tracks like scripture, and these told a story that made his weathered hands tighten around his rifle. The winter of 1894 had been merciless, even by frontier standards. Snow fell so thick it seemed to erase the world itself, turning familiar landmarks into ghostly suggestions. Most folks in the territory had battened down for the season, but Thaddeus couldn't afford that luxury. Cattle needed tending, fences needed mending, and solitude needed protecting. At 62, he'd grown comfortable with the weight of isolation that pressed against his shoulders like an old coat. But this morning felt different. The air carried something beyond the usual bite of December cold. Something that made the horses restless in their stalls and sent ravens wheeling overhead in nervous circles. Thaddeus had learned long ago to trust those instincts that lived deeper than thought, instincts that had kept him alive through the war and 20 years of frontier living. Following the blood trail, his boots crunched through snow that came nearly to his knees. Each step revealed more of the story. Someone small, someone hurt, someone running. The stride pattern spoke of desperation, of stumbling through darkness with fear as a compass. Thaddeus had seen enough desperate people in his life to recognize the signs. The trail led him past the old oak that marked his northern boundary, past the creek bed that would be singing with spring water in a few months but now lay silent under ice. The blood grew fresher, more frequent. Whoever this was, they weren't far ahead. Then he saw her. A young native girl, maybe 16, lay motionless in a natural hollow between two fallen logs. Snow had drifted around her like nature's own burial shroud, and for a terrible moment Thaddeus thought he'd arrived too late. Her dark hair, braided but now loose and tangled, spread across the white ground like spilled ink. Traditional deerskin clothing, torn and stained, clung to a frame too thin for the brutal cold. Thaddeus approached slowly, his rifle held ready but pointed down. The girl's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths that sent small puffs of vapor into the frozen air. Alive, but barely. Dark blood stained her left leg and both hands, though the wounds looked more like scrapes from a fall than anything deliberately inflicted. He knelt beside her, professional caution warring with human concern. In all his years of isolation, he'd avoided exactly this kind of complication. The last thing a man like him needed was to get involved in whatever tribal conflicts or territorial disputes had driven a young woman to flee into a snowstorm. But as he looked down at her face, peaceful despite the circumstances, something shifted in his chest. Something he hadn't felt since Eleanor died 15 years ago. The girl's features reminded him of his late wife's quiet strength, of the same high cheekbones and strong jaw that had first caught his attention at a trading post in Missouri a lifetime ago. Thaddeus had spent decades trying to forget that feeling of responsibility for another human being. The guilt of failing Eleanor, of not protecting her from the cruelty of people who couldn't accept their marriage, had driven him to this remote corner of Wyoming where neighbors were myths and conversation was a luxury he couldn't afford. Now, with this unconscious girl growing colder by the minute, those walls he'd built around his heart began to crack like ice in spring. He slipped his arms under her slight frame and lifted her with surprising gentleness for such calloused hands. She weighed almost nothing, as if the cold had hollowed her out from the inside. Her head lolled against his chest, and he could feel her heartbeat, weak but steady, through the layers of clothing. The walk back to his cabin felt longer than usual, each step deliberate and careful. The girl stirred once, mumbling something in a language he didn't recognize, but her eyes remained closed. Thaddeus found himself talking to her in low tones, the way he'd once talked to spooked horses or Eleanor during her fevered nights. His cabin appeared through the snow like a promise. Smoke still rose from the chimney, and warm yellow light spilled from the windows onto the white ground. Home had never felt more necessary or more fragile than it did in that moment, carrying this stranger who would change everything about his carefully constructed solitude. As he climbed the steps to his porch, Thaddeus Morrow had no idea that by sunrise, the sound of ancient drums would echo across his land, calling him toward a reckoning he'd spent 20 years trying to avoid. Inside the cabin's warmth, Thaddeus laid the girl on Eleanor's old quilt near the fireplace. The fabric, faded blue with small yellow flowers, had been stored away for 15 years, but tonight it seemed right to bring it back into the light. The girl's skin looked gray against the colorful pattern, her lips nearly blue from the cold that had seeped into her bones. He worked with the methodical precision of a man who'd tended wounds before. First, he stoked the fire until flames danced high enough to drive the chill from the room. Then he filled his largest pot with water and set it to heat, the same way he'd done countless times for injured cattle or the occasional hurt animal he'd found on his land. But this felt different. More personal. More dangerous. Thaddeus had spent 2 decades avoiding exactly this kind of connection. After Eleanor's death, he'd sworn off caring for anyone who might need more than he could safely give. Caring led to loss, and loss led to the kind of pain that followed a man like a shadow, growing longer as the years passed. The girl stirred as warmth began to seep back into her body. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing dark eyes that immediately fixed on his face with startling intensity. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched him with the careful stillness of a deer that had spotted a hunter. Thaddeus recognized that look. He'd worn it himself often enough. "Easy now," he said softly, keeping his hands visible and his movements slow. "You're safe here. Just got some cleaning up to do." She understood English, he could tell by the slight shift in her expression, but she remained silent. When he reached for her injured leg, she tensed but didn't pull away. That small act of trust hit him harder than he'd expected. The wounds weren't severe, mostly scrapes and cuts from her fall down the rocky slope. Her hands had taken the worst of it, palms torn from grabbing at stones and branches during her tumble. As he cleaned each injury with warm water and the bottle of whiskey he kept for emergencies, she never made a sound. Not even when the alcohol must have burned like fire against the raw flesh. "Strong as ironwood," he murmured, a phrase Eleanor used to say about the Shoshone women she'd known. The girl's eyes sharpened at the words, and for the first time, something that might have been curiosity replaced the wariness in her gaze. As he worked, Thaddeus found himself remembering other hands he'd tended. Eleanor's, after she'd cut herself trying to repair their broken window. His own, after fights with men who'd called him names for marrying an Indian woman. The memory of those days, when love had seemed strong enough to overcome hatred, made his chest tight. The girl watched his face as he bandaged her hands with strips torn from an old shirt. She seemed to be reading something there, some story written in the lines around his eyes and the gray stubble on his jaw. When he finished, she touched 2 fingers to her heart, then extended her hand toward him palm up. A gesture of gratitude that needed no translation. "Name's Thaddeus," he offered, settling back in his chair by the fire. "Thaddeus Morrow." She considered this for a long moment, then spoke her first word. "El Shani." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried weight, like a name that meant something important. They sat in comfortable silence as snow continued to fall outside. The fire crackled and hissed, sending dancing shadows across the cabin walls. Thaddeus made coffee, black and strong, and offered her a cup. She accepted it with both hands, wrapping her bandaged fingers around the warm ceramic like it was something precious. Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken. Through the window, Thaddeus could see the first gray hints of dawn creeping across the sky. Soon the sun would rise over the mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink. It would be beautiful, the kind of morning that reminded a man why he'd chosen this hard, lonely life. But as he watched Ailshani sip her coffee and stare into the flames, Thaddeus felt something shifting inside him. The walls he'd built around his heart were cracking, letting in feelings he thought were buried with Eleanor. This girl, this stranger who'd appeared in his life like a gift wrapped in snow, was changing something fundamental about who he thought he was. Dawn arrived with surprising suddenness, flooding the cabin with pale light. Ailshani set down her empty cup and moved to the window, looking out at the transformed landscape with an expression Thaddeus couldn't quite read. Her body had gone very still, as if she was listening for something beyond the reach of his aging ears. Then it came. Low and deep, rolling across the snow-covered valley like thunder that wouldn't end. The sound of drums, ancient and rhythmic, echoing off the mountains and seeming to rise from the very earth itself. Elshani closed her eyes and smiled. The drumbeat continued for 3 more minutes, each rhythmic pulse seeming to vibrate through the cabin's wooden walls and into Thaddeus's chest. He'd heard tribal drums before, during his army days and in the early years with Eleanor, but never like this. Never so close, never so deliberate, never carrying what felt like a message meant specifically for him. Elshani remained at the window, her bandaged hands pressed against the glass. When the drums finally faded into mountain silence, she turned to face him. For the first time since he'd found her, she looked completely unafraid. "They know," she said simply. Thaddeus set down his coffee cup with hands that weren't quite steady. "Know what?" "That you saved me. That your heart is not like the others." She moved away from the window and sat cross-legged on the floor near the fireplace, wincing slightly as her injured leg adjusted to the position. The drums speak gratitude. They speak recognition. The weight of her words settled over him like a heavy blanket. Recognition. In 20 years of self-imposed exile, Thaddeus had convinced himself that invisibility was safety. That if he kept to himself, tended his cattle, and spoke to no one about Eleanor or the life they'd tried to build together, he could exist in a pocket of peace that the world couldn't touch. But peace built on hiding was fragile as winter ice, and now it was cracking beneath him. "How many of them?" he asked. "Enough." Elshani pulled her dark hair over one shoulder and began working it into a fresh braid with her bandaged fingers. "My grandfather leads them. He has seen 60 winters and knows the old ways of reading signs. Last night, he dreamed of snow turning to spring water, of wounds healing clean. He knew someone would find me." Thaddeus walked to his kitchen and began preparing breakfast, needing something to do with his hands while his mind processed this information. Bacon sizzled in the iron skillet, filling the cabin with rich, familiar smells that somehow made everything feel more real and more impossible at the same time. "What kind of signs?" he asked, cracking eggs into the hot grease. "Your fire last night. How it burned straight up despite the wind. The way the smoke scattered in 4 directions before rising to the sky. And..." She paused, watching him carefully. "The way you touched my forehead when you carried me inside. Like my grandmother used to do when I was small and sick with fever." Thaddeus's hand stilled on the spatula. He didn't remember touching her forehead, but now that she mentioned it, he could almost feel the memory of cool skin beneath his palm. The unconscious gesture of someone who'd once cared for a fevered wife through long, frightening nights. "My Eleanor was Crow," he said quietly, not turning around. "Different tribe, but some things are the same, I suppose." "Was," Elshani repeated, catching the past tense. She crossed over. 15 years ago. Pneumonia. The eggs were done, but he kept stirring them anyway. People in town never accepted her. Never accepted us. After she died, I came here. Haven't talked to another soul for longer than it takes to buy supplies. Until now. Until now." They ate breakfast in thoughtful silence, the weight of shared understanding growing between them. Outside, the sun climbed higher, turning the snow-covered landscape into a blinding field of light punctuated by the dark spears of pine trees. Beautiful and harsh, like everything else in this territory that demanded strength from anyone who wanted to call it home. As Elshani finished her eggs, she began to speak again, her voice taking on the cadence of someone telling an important story. 3 days ago, men came to our winter camp. White men with badges that meant nothing in our territory, but they carried guns that meant everything. They said the government had work for strong young people. Said we would be paid, fed, given warm clothes. Her expression darkened. But my cousin Running Bear had worked for such men before. He came back changed, hollow. He warned us it was not work but something else. Something that took more than it gave. Thaddeus felt a familiar anger building in his chest, the same rage that had driven him to fight in a war he thought was about freedom, only to learn that freedom was often just another word for power wearing a prettier dress. "So you ran." "We all scattered when the moon went dark. I got separated in the storm, fell down the rocks trying to find shelter." She touched her bandaged leg absently. but the drums this morning mean I am not lost anymore. My people know where I am, and they know you are not like those other men." Through the cabin window, Thaddeus could see movement in the treeline. Dark figures on horseback, barely visible against the winter landscape but unmistakably there. Watching. Waiting. The drums had been just the beginning. By midday, the riders emerged from the forest. 3 men on horseback, moving with the unhurried confidence of those who belonged to this land long before maps gave it English names. The eldest rode a paint horse, his gray hair braided with what looked like strips of red cloth that caught the winter sunlight like small flames. Thaddeus watched them approach through his kitchen window, his rifle within reach but untouched. Beside him, Ailshani stood perfectly still, her dark eyes tracking the riders with an expression that mixed relief with something deeper. Pride, maybe, or recognition of a moment that would change everything. "The one in front," she said softly. "That is my grandfather, Joseph Walking Bear." The drums were his idea. The riders stopped 50 yards from the cabin, close enough for conversation but far enough to show respect for territorial boundaries. The old man raised his right hand in greeting, then dismounted with the careful precision of someone whose joints had seen too many hard winters. Thaddeus found himself moving toward the door without conscious decision. 20 years of isolation had made him forget the pull of human connection, but something about this moment felt inevitable, like a river finally reaching the sea. He stepped onto his porch, Ailshani close behind him. The cold air bit at his face, but the sun was warm on his shoulders, creating that peculiar combination of winter discomfort and promise that marked the turning of seasons. "Thaddeus Morrow," the old man called, his English clear and deliberate. "I am Joseph Walking Bear. You have cared for my granddaughter. We have come to speak with you." There was something in the man's tone that reminded Thaddeus of Eleanor's father, who had also carried authority like a comfortable coat, wearing it without arrogance or apology. He walked down from his porch, each step feeling like a choice between the man he had been and the man he might still become. "She's welcome to stay as long as needed," Thaddeus said when they were close enough for normal conversation. "Wasn't going to turn away someone hurt in a storm." Joseph Walking Bear studied him with eyes that seemed to see through skin and bone straight to whatever truth lived beneath. "The drums told us you have a good heart. But hearts can be good and still be afraid. Are you afraid of us, Thaddeus Morrow?" The question hung in the air like winter breath. Thaddeus thought about Eleanor, about the townspeople who had made their life together impossible, about the years he'd spent hiding from exactly this kind of moment when the past insisted on becoming present. "Used to be," he answered honestly. "Afraid of caring too much and losing it again. Afraid of not being strong enough when it mattered." He glanced at Ailshani, who was watching him with those intense dark eyes. "Maybe still am, a little." Joseph Walking Bear nodded as if this was exactly the answer he'd expected. "Fear is not weakness when it comes from love. My granddaughter says you touched her forehead like family would. Says you used cloth that belonged to someone precious to you. Eleanor's quilt." Thaddeus felt his throat tighten. "My wife died 15 years ago. People didn't approve of our marriage. Made things hard for her. And you have been alone since then. Seemed safer that way." The old man was quiet for a long moment, studying the cabin, the corrals, the careful way Thaddeus had built a life that asked nothing from anyone else. When he spoke again, his voice carried gentle authority. "Safety built on loneliness is not safety. It is just another kind of dying." He gestured toward Ailshani. "My granddaughter could have frozen in that storm. Instead, she found someone who remembered how to care for another person. The spirits guided her to your door for a reason." Thaddeus looked at Ailshani, who had moved to stand beside her grandfather. She was stronger now, the color back in her cheeks, her wounded hands already healing clean. But more than that, she looked like someone who had found what she'd been searching for without knowing she was searching. "There are men still looking for our young people," Joseph Walking Bear continued. "Men with badges and guns who think they can take what they want because the law is written in their favor. We cannot fight them with weapons, but we can fight them with community. With people who remember that kindness is stronger than fear." The invitation was clear without being spoken aloud. Join us. Be part of something larger than your own carefully guarded solitude. Help us protect what matters. Thaddeus felt the walls around his heart crack completely open, letting in light he'd forgotten existed. Eleanor would have wanted this for him. Would have wanted him to find his way back to the living world, to people who understood that love was worth the risk of loss. "I've got good land here," he said slowly. "Big enough for more than just one stubborn old rancher. Room for people who need a place to be safe while they figure out what comes next." Elshani smiled then, bright as sunrise after the longest night. Joseph Walking Bear placed a weathered hand on Thaddeus's shoulder, and for the first time in 20 years, the weight of isolation lifted from his chest. The drumbeat had called him home to himself. What did you think of this story? Did Thaddeus's journey from isolation to community resonate with you? Drop a comment below and let me know which moment hit you the most. Was it when he found Elshani in the snow, or when he finally opened his heart to her people? And if you enjoyed this tale of healing and second chances, make sure to subscribe for more stories that explore the power of human connection. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a new chapter, and share this with someone who believes in the healing power of kindness. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most important journeys happen when we stop running from who we're meant to become.